On a summer morning in 1915, in the very heart of the city of Chicago, a great steamship rolled over and sank. It killed 844 people. It did not sink out on the open lake, in a storm, far from help. It sank at the dock. It was still tied to the wharf, in a river you could almost throw a stone across, and it had not yet moved an inch. The people on board were not travelers or strangers. They were the workers of a single factory and their families, dressed in their best, going on a company picnic. It was meant to be the happiest day of their summer. More people died that morning than died as passengers on the Titanic. It remains the worst loss of life in any single shipwreck on the Great Lakes, and the deadliest day in the entire history of Chicago. And almost no one remembers it. This is the story of the Eastland, and of how a ship could kill 800 people without ever leaving the dock. To understand the day, you have to understand the people on board. Just outside Chicago stood one of the largest factories in the world, the Hawthorne Works of the Western Electric Company. Thousands of people work there, many of them immigrants, Polish, Czech, and Hungarian families who had come to the city for the work. The factory was the center of their lives, and the people they worked beside were their neighbors and friends. Every summer, the company held a great picnic. A day off, a boat across the lake to Michigan City, music and food and games on the grass. In 1915, it was the 5th time they had done it, and thousands were expected to go. So in the dark, early hours of that Saturday morning, the families began to gather at the Chicago River, dressed in their Sunday best. Whole households came together, parents and children, the young men and women of the factory, all in a holiday mood. Waiting for them at the wharf, on the south bank of the river between the Clark Street and LaSalle Street bridges, was the first of the steamers that would carry them. She was the Eastland. The Eastland was a large steel passenger steamer of the Great Lakes, fast and handsome, once advertised as the speed queen of the lakes. On paper, she was licensed to carry around 2,500 people, and that morning, that is very nearly how many came aboard her. A little after 6:30, the gangways opened, and the crowd began to flow onto the ship. Families spread out across the decks, the band began to play, and for a while it was exactly the bright, ordinary morning everyone had hoped for. But the Eastland carried a hidden flaw, one that the people streaming aboard her had no way of knowing about. She was, by her very design, top-heavy. She was tall and narrow, with a great deal of weight high up in her decks and not enough to hold her steady down below. Ships like that float, but they balance on a knife's edge, and they do not like to be leaned on. This was not a secret to the people who ran her. In her years on the lakes, the Eastland had listed and tilted before, leaning over at the dock and out on the water, enough to frighten passengers more than once. And then, only months before, something had been added that made it worse. 3 years earlier, the Titanic had sunk, with far too few lifeboats for the people on board, and the world had been horrified. In answer, a new federal law required ships to carry enough lifeboats and rafts for everyone aboard. It was a good law, born of good intentions, meant to make sure that no one would ever again be left without a place in a boat. But on a ship that was already top-heavy, all of that new equipment came at a price. The extra lifeboats and rafts were heavy, and they were bolted high up on her upper decks, adding still more weight exactly where she could least afford it. To keep a ship like this upright, the crew used ballast, tanks deep in the hull that they filled with water to weigh her down and balance her. On the morning of the picnic, that balancing act would have to be done perfectly, in a hurry, with the decks filling above. It was not. As the passengers came aboard, the Eastland began, very gently, to lean. At first it was nothing, the small movement of a ship taking on weight, and the engineers below worked the ballast tanks to bring her back. But the crowd kept coming, more than 2,000 people now, spreading across her decks, and the ship grew harder and harder to hold level. She leaned one way, was corrected, then slowly leaned the other. By about 7:10, she was full. Somewhere around 2,500 people were aboard, almost all of them up on the decks in the warm morning air, looking out at the river and the city. And the Eastland began to lean toward the river, away from the dock, and this time she did not come back. Slowly, steadily, the deck began to tilt under everyone's feet. At first, many of the passengers laughed. The slow roll of the deck felt like a joke, like a funfair ride, and people grabbed the rails and grinned at each other as cups and bottles began to slide. Below, the crew fought to save her, working the ballast, trying to pull her back upright against the weight of 2,000 people and her own bad balance. But the lean was winning, and it was growing. Water began to come in through the low openings on the riverside, the portholes and the gangways now tilting down toward the water. And once the river started to come in, the end came very fast. On the decks, the laughter stopped. The tilt steepened past the point where anyone could stand. People began to slide, then to fall, down the sloping deck toward the rail and the dark water of the river. And then, slowly, almost gently, the Eastland lay down on her side in the river. She rolled over to port, away from the dock, until she came to rest on the river bottom, with her hull turned up to the sky. The river there was only about 20 feet deep. So she did not vanish. She simply lay on her side in the water, half of her still above the surface, like a great dead whale, in the middle of the city. It had taken only a few minutes, from the first serious lean to the final roll. And in those few minutes, the morning had split into two completely different fates, depending on where a person had been standing. Those who had been on the high side, or up on the open top deck, were spilled out across the hull or thrown clear into the river. Many of them could be pulled out. For them, it was a terror, and then a rescue. But hundreds of others had been down inside the ship, in the cabins and on the lower decks, sheltered from the morning sun. When the Eastland rolled, the river poured in, and the inside of the ship became a trap. Furniture, pianos, tables, and people were thrown together against what had been the walls and were now the floor. In the sudden dark, with water rising and no clear way out, escape became almost impossible. And all of this happened a few steps from solid ground. The hull lay against the wharf. People on the dock could reach out and touch the ship. They could see faces at the portholes, on the wrong side of the steel. It happened in front of thousands of witnesses. The riverbanks, the bridges, the windows of the buildings along the water were crowded with people who could only stand and watch, and listen, and be able to do nothing. In the river itself, hundreds of people were now in the water at once. Those who had been thrown clear struggled in their heavy, soaked summer clothes, in a river that was deep enough to drown in. Most of them could not swim. They reached for anything, for each other, for the wooden crates and planks and chicken coops that people on shore began throwing into the water to give them something to hold. Men dived in from the wharves and from passing boats. A nearby tug came alongside, and people formed human chains to pull the living from the river. Many were saved this way, dragged up dripping onto the deck and the dock. But for those still trapped inside the overturned hull, there was no reaching them from the river. They were sealed inside the steel, below the water line, where no rescuer in the water could go. So the rescuers went to the hull itself. Men climbed onto the great curved side of the ship, now lying flat above the surface, and could hear, beneath their feet, the people trapped inside. Workers were brought with torches and cut holes straight through the steel of the hull. Through these openings, they pulled out everyone they could still reach in time. Some came out alive. Far more did not. For hour after hour, the work went on, cutting, reaching, lifting people out of the ship and the river. But the truth was that most of it had been decided in those first few minutes, when the Eastland lay down in the water. By the end, the river and the ship gave up their dead in numbers that the city could hardly believe. They were carried out and laid in long rows along the wharf, under the summer sky. The bodies were taken to a huge armory hall nearby, turned overnight into a place to lay out the dead. There they were placed in rows, hundreds of them, and the families came to find their own. They came from the streets around the factory, walking the long lines, looking for a husband, a wife, a son, a daughter, a whole family that had set out that morning for a day at the lake. When the count was finally done, the scale of it was almost unbearable. 844 people had died. More than had died as passengers on the Titanic, 3 years before. And the dead were young. Around 7 in every 10 of them were under the age of 25. Many were children. Many were the young men and women of the factory, in the first years of their working lives. 22 entire families were wiped out completely, every single member, parents and children together, gone in one morning. There were homes near the factory where no one came back at all. The community around the Hawthorne Works was devastated in a way that is hard to imagine. Street after street was in mourning at once. There were blocks where almost every household had lost someone they loved. It was the deadliest single day in the history of Chicago, and the worst shipwreck the Great Lakes had ever seen. And it had happened at a city wharf, in a few minutes, to a ship that never sailed. A disaster like this demanded answers, and the questions began at once. How could a ship roll over and kill 800 people while it was still tied to the dock? The investigations would drag on for nearly 20 years. The captain, the chief engineer, the officials of the steamship company, and the inspectors who had passed the ship as safe were all caught up in it. There was plenty of blame to share. The ship was top-heavy and known to be unstable. The ballast had not held her. The new safety equipment, added with the best intentions, had helped to make a dangerous ship more dangerous still. But in the end, after all those years of hearings and trials, almost no one was held responsible. The criminal charges failed. The owners were found not to be liable. The law could not seem to find a single person to answer for 844 deaths. The Eastland herself was raised from the river a few months later. She was sold, rebuilt, and handed to the Navy, who renamed her and used her for the rest of her life as a training ship. The name Eastland was quietly erased. And then, slowly, the whole thing began to fade from memory. For a disaster of this size, in the middle of a great American city, it has been forgotten to a degree that is genuinely strange. Part of the reason is who the dead were. There was no one rich or famous aboard the Eastland, no first-class passengers, no celebrated names. There were only working immigrant families, the kind of people the wider world is quick to forget. And part of it was the time. The world in 1915 was at war. Just 2 months earlier, a great liner, the Lusitania, had been torpedoed, and the headlines were full of it. A quiet local tragedy at a Chicago dock was soon buried beneath all of that. Today there is a plaque near the river where it happened, and stones in the cemeteries where the families lie. For the deadliest day in the history of one of the largest cities in America, that is very nearly all there is. 844 people died on a summer morning, at a dock, on a ship that never sailed, simply because they came aboard for a day in the sun. They asked for nothing more than that, and they deserve to be remembered. In our next episode, we travel to the coast of West Africa, to a crowded ferry that set out one night into a storm, and took more people down with it than the Titanic. Subscribe, so you don't miss it.